So now I want to shift our focus to eventually I want to talk about the environmental racism, right? But before we get there, let's talk about how this affects poor people, maybe unhoused people. You and I both live in a place that's very hot. And so I was reading something recently that I was really kind of reading a piece that gave me some insight into what day-to-day life is like for folks who are unhoused. And because most people just kind of live their lives and don't really take a moment to, I guess, pull back the curtain and examine the humanity, that there's a human being there that is only fiscally poor, and as a result of that, suffering at the worst end of everything that's happening with respect to the climate. I want to get your thoughts on kind of what that must be like, or give some insight to our listeners on how they're affected.
Yeah. So the unsheltered communities who do not have housing, who are living outside, are the most vulnerable to climate change, because climate change is causing increased natural disasters. If you don't have shelter, that means that you're facing that with no protection. Yeah. In Phoenix, in July, they just released they call it the transient death list. I don't like to use that term, but the unsheltered death list, they just released. Over 312 people died in Maricopa, over 200 in Phoenix. And the thing that is difficult in determining these deaths, they won't immediately call them heat deaths. They, have to do all sorts of autopsies and investigations. Sure. But it does feel like a smokescreen to really, because over 200 people dying in one city in 1 month is a crisis. Yep. But they're saying, oh, well, they had drugs in their system, so it could have been the drugs. But, we know, like, if you're living outside, you're going to have to take coping methods, maybe it's drugs, maybe it's alcohol, but that's not why they died, and it could have been a contributing factor. But we know that this is definitely was caused by the extreme heat. And so when, whether it's, extreme heat, whether it's the hurricanes, whether it's flooding, all of the people who don't have shelter, they're going to die first. Yes. And the worst part is that our society has deemed them unworthy because of, the capitalist society we live in. They're like, well, if you don't succeed in capitalism, blame yourself, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It allows us not to have humanity for them, because 200 people dying in a month, that should be a crisis. There should be, federal funds. There should be emergency. We should do something. But because of this narrative, they're able to say they're not worthy. And then when we look at who makes up the unsheltered populations, by and large, across the United States, Black and Indigenous people are the people dying are at the highest rates of being unsheltered. Sure. And so this is, again, homelessness. This is a communities of color issue.
Sure. Now, let's take this a step further, okay? I want to do a bit of reading. I'm going to read from nrdc.org, and we're going to talk a bit about environmental racism. These things are connected, but it's going to sound like a shift in topic, but follow me. The lead in Flint, Michigan's water, the toxic petrochemical plants in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, the raw sewage backing up into homes in Centerville, Illinois, and the oil and gas projects that overburden some U.S. tribal reservations, looking at you, Dakota Access Pipeline, all have at least one thing in common. They're all examples of environmental racism. The phrase environmental racism was coined by civil rights leader Dr. Benjamin F. Chavis Jr. He defined it as the intentional siting of pollution and waste facilities in communities primarily populated by African Americans, Latinos, Indigenous people, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders, migrant farm workers, and low-income workers. Study after study has since shown that those communities are disproportionately exposed to fumes, toxic dust, ash, soot, and other pollutants such as hazardous facilities located in their midst. As a result, they faced increased risks of health problems like cancer and respiratory issues. Now, when you combine these the dirty business practices that lead to disparate healthcare outcomes for Black and brown people in Black and brown communities with the dirty business practices that contribute to climate change, you realize that Black and brown people are at the receiving end of the worst of both issues. I want to talk to you a bit about maybe some of the things in your estimation that might lead to environmental racism, people feeling like they can get away with this.
Yeah, so it has to do with a few things. One, the social determinants of health, which is a sociological term, which is a lot of big words for tell me where you live and I'll tell you how you're living. And so based on your neighborhood, it can determine like what grocery stores do you have access to, what's zoned into your neighborhoods, because a lot of Black and brown neighborhoods oftentimes are zoned industrial. It makes the housing cheaper, so more affordable, but it also means that dirty industries can pollute there. Sure. And then you have the issues of redlining. And so decades of disinvestment again cause the communities to be more vulnerable. So with all this combined, it makes our communities less healthy, so more vulnerable to these impacts. And it also means that we're going to have more pollutants into our neighborhoods. And so when you look at in a lot of cities, be it Seattle and Phoenix, I can speak to specifically the difference between living in the South End and the North End can have up to a decade of difference in lifespan. Just the same city, but we're living in two different realities based on our zip code. And so it makes a huge difference. And they're able to do, they like to call it, this colorblind racism, where they're like, oh, we're not targeting them. We just happen to put this industrial plant in their neighborhood, and so they're able to, they talk about racism without racist, but they're still contributing to killing Black and brown lives. When in Phoenix, for example, people in the South End, they have higher rates of asthma. That means when COVID hit, they're more likely to die. Exactly. And so it has all of these additional impacts. And again, why do they have the highest rates of asthma? They have the highest rates of pollutants because it was zoned industrial.
There's something that Q and I talk about on the show quite a bit. We have been rightfully critical of capitalism in general. And there's been some pushback here and there because there are people who are fans of capitalism. It does have its benefits. I will cede that. When it's unfettered, it becomes problematic for everyone. But on this show, at least, we don't really, we try to have a human first approach to things. And we realize that capitalism causes really bad people to become very powerful, and they are often given to their worst instincts, greed and apathy, right? And so you start to see that it's, when you're mentioning that, people can call it like colorblind racism. It's they're not intentionally targeting a neighborhood. They're just going where they're going to get the least funk, where they're going to get the least pushback, where the people have the least amount of political power and the lowest capacity to actually stop something like that from happening. In other words, these corporations go after the most vulnerable because it's cheaper to go after them. It protects their bottom line more than going after an affluent neighborhood to put some industrial waste plant there. And again, the fact that oftentimes these communities are disenfranchised, it ensures that people will continue to make money hand over fist and then go live in a community where it's free from pollutants and free from really the harshest effects of climate change and on. And then we're stuck at the bottom again. And so now you're starting to see why this was kind of an important topic that I wanted to discuss. I'm going to read a little bit more and then I want to get some more of your thoughts. So why does environmental racism exist? All right. It's a form of systemic racism, and it exists largely because of policies and practices that have historically and to this day favored the health, well-being, and consumer choices of white communities over those of non-white, low-income communities. Case in point, General Iron is a metal shredding business that operated in Chicago's predominantly white, wealthy Lincoln Park neighborhood. In 2018, emails showed that city officials from then Mayor Rahm Emanuel, his administration, pushed the business to move out of this neighborhood. And after community members complained, and to make way for a multi-billion-dollar private real estate development, the city then struck a deal to relocate the polluting operation to Chicago's predominantly Latino, low-income, and working-class southeast side neighborhood. So you start to realize that there's big business, there's crony capitalism, there's people that do these kind of backdoor deals. And not only like where you and I might think, well, why don't they just clean up their business practices? There's no governmental incentive to do it, and really no consequences if they don't, right? I recall the former president, I won't say his name, but him kind of dismantling certain parts of the EPA to make it easier for companies to pollute in the interests of, business. And when everyone looks at that and is like, okay, well, that's good for business, you don't look at the effects of how does this affect the communities surrounding it. But those communities, again, the voices don't often make it that far. And so I'm glad that there's people like you and that you would come up on the show and help people learn a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the whole idea of jobs versus the environment is such a false dichotomy that was created by big businesses, but there's no jobs on a dead planet.
Thank you.
And we're already seeing that. The farmers, the impacts of this extreme heat wave, some of the work that I do, some of the mutual aid work that we do, we bring up produce directly from farms to up to the Navajo Nation. And what we found was the farms are saying we don't have the crops. They all died. And so, that's a huge job impact. When you're looking at the cost of rebuilding entire cities like Maui, that's a huge economic impact. And so the longer that we put off addressing climate, the more expensive it's going to become. Yeah. But it's also important to talk about, while it's important to recycle, it's, like ride your bike when you can, use public transit. The reality is 2/3 of emissions are caused by 90 corporations. Yeah. So at the end of the day, we have to hold these corporations responsible. They're destroying our future. They're destroying everything.
Yeah. So with that in mind, I know that there's a whole lot more for us to talk about here. So I would appreciate if you stick around, because I definitely want to cover the rest of this with you.
Yeah.